Imagine a world where people lived for centuries, where rivers braided through a garden so lush they seemed to sing, where the first songs and the first forges were begun at the same time that the first murder stained the soil. What did life look like before the flood? Not a single picture, but a mosaic, brilliance and beauty, vocation and intimacy with the Creator, alongside a quiet rot that would widen until it demanded mercy and judgment both. We will travel this ancient landscape together, from the cool shade of Eden to the threshold of the deluge. Along the way you will meet the first couple and their calling, the brothers whose rivalry opened human history to violence, the lines that leaned toward God and the lines that turned from Him, and a handful of figures who stand as beacons of hope before the storm. If you want the next chapter, Noah building the ark and the flood itself, subscribe now so you don't miss it. In the beginning, creation bore the stamp of a hand that delights in color, texture, and order. The garden called Eden is described with simple, striking details. A river that split into 4 great branches, trees pleasing to the sight and good for food, and 2 remarkable trees that anchored the story, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Genesis 2. Picture sunlight pouring through leaves so bright they seem to glow, the air heavy with fruit aromas, and a sense of purposeful peace that comes when everything is as it was meant to be. Into that ordered beauty, God placed a man and a woman and set them to a task that was not punishment but vocation. Adam was put in the garden to till it and keep it, to tend, to steward, to name the living things and to see the world flourish under God's care, Genesis 2:15-20. Work in that pristine scene was not drudgery, but participation in creative rule. Naming the animals was an act of relationship, to know, to call, to bring creatures into ordered speech with humanity. Consider the intimacy of it. The Creator walking with His creatures, conversing with them, shaping them into a community of care. The relationship between God and the first humans was immediate and personal. Scripture paints a picture of fellowship so near that it uses the language of walking. God moved among His creation. The man and the woman walked and talked with their Maker. They knew one another. Marriage is introduced here not as a social contract, but as the joining of 2 into one flesh, a companionship that stands at the core of human identity. The man and woman were naked and not ashamed. There was no barrier, no fear, no self-protective covering between them and God, Genesis 2:23-25. But freedom always has an edge. The garden's liberty came with a single prohibition. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was set as a test, a boundary that respected human choice. Temptation does not arrive with a trumpet blast. It comes with a whisper and a question that rearranges certainties. The serpent's subtlety lay in suggesting doubt about God's goodness, in offering a new kind of knowledge that promised autonomy and power. The woman and then the man ate, and with that act the world was altered, Genesis 3. The consequences were immediate and piercingly human. Shame entered language and costume. Fig leaves covered what had been freely revealed. Relationships shifted between husband and wife, between humanity and nature, and between humanity and God. The ground, once open to the gardener's stewardship, became a place of thorns and sweat. Work was transformed from vocation into toil. Childbearing would be accompanied by pain. Mortality, previously unknown as experience, entered the human horizon. The very possibility of death reframed what it meant to live. God's response to the breach was just, but not without sorrow. Barriers were erected, cherubim and a flaming sword guarding the way back to the tree of life, and humanity stepped out of Eden into a world now marked by struggle and consequence. Genesis 3:22-24. Yet exile was not only a story of loss, it is the opening of a new chapter where human beings exercise their freedom in ways that would shape the culture of generations. Out of Eden, the human family multiplies and scatters. They labor, they build, they discover. But human creativity becomes ambivalent. Wonders and weapons, songs and swordplay, tents and cities rise together. Take Cain and Abel, two brothers whose lives embody the fork in the road faced by human beings after the fall. Abel tended flocks. Cain tilled the soil. Each brought an offering. One offering was accepted, the other rejected. Scripture leaves room to meditate on why. It focuses attention not on the goods themselves, but on the posture of the heart. Jealousy kindled when the elder brother perceived rejection, and that jealousy proved deadly. The first murder, an act that ruptures the human family, was not merely a crime. It was the eruption of a heart hardened against God and neighbor, Genesis 4:1-8. Cain's sentence was exile, but it did not end human activity. Rather than disappearing, Cain moved and founded a city, naming it for his son, and from his line came developments that would mark civilization, the making of tents and livestock management, the birth of music and instruments, craftsmanship with bronze and iron. Jabal, Jubal, Tubal-Cain, names that appear suddenly in the genealogy, stand for the beginnings of pastoral life, musical artistry, and metalworking respectively. Genesis 4:20-22. These are the first brushstrokes of culture, the human capacity to innovate, to shape tools and sounds, to create shelter. Yet alongside these gifts ran a thread of pride and violence. Where innovation stood without humility before God, it could be turned toward self-exaltation. Lamech, 5 generations from Cain, gives voice to that turning. His brief, grim song boasts of a vengeance multiplied, a culture that measures honor by the force one can wield. Technology and art, when divorced from moral restraint, can magnify cruelty. What begins as human ingenuity quickly becomes a means to harm when hearts are set against one another. Genesis 4:23-24. The city of Cain's descendants is therefore a paradox, evolutionary leaps for human life and a descent into normalized violence. Contrast this with the other branch of humanity, the line through Seth. After Abel's death and the sorrow that followed, Adam and Eve had another son, Seth, a child through whom the hope of calling on God would be preserved. In Seth's line, we find a recurrent phrase. People began to call upon the name of the Lord, Genesis 4:26. That phrase is small but seismic. It marks a community that remembered God amid the spread of sin. Where Cain's line built cities and instruments, Seth's line began again to orient their lives toward worship and reliance. Among Seth's descendants, one figure stands out with startling obscurity and luminous significance: Enoch. Of him, the text says simply that he walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. Genesis 5:24. There are 2 things to note here. First, Enoch is presented as someone whose life is defined by intimacy with the Lord, walking with God as a regular way of life. Second, his end is unique. Rather than dying in the usual way, Enoch is taken by God. Later scriptural reflection names him among the faithful, see Hebrews 11:5, but in the original telling his departure functions as a sign. Even amid increasing corruption, God preserves a way of walking that pleases him. Enoch's son, Methuselah, becomes in turn a living bridge across generations. Methuselah's long life stretches toward the next watershed figure. His age, recorded in the genealogies, marks a different rhythm of time. While we should not force modern explanations onto these numbers, we are given a pattern. People lived long lives across these generations, which shaped family memory and cultural transmission in ways unlike our present experience. Methuselah's son, Lamech, here another Lamech, of a different lineage, names his child Noah, saying that this child will bring comfort from the toil of the ground that the Lord has cursed. Genesis 5:28-29. The name Noah, meaning rest or comfort, is a prophetic hope voiced in the midst of a world already learning the bitter lessons of the curse. This is the two-track world emerging. On one side, the descendants of Cain, forging cities, music, and metal. On the other, the descendants of Seth, calling on the name of the Lord, producing walkers in faith like Enoch and fathers who name their children with expectant prayers like Lamech. These tracks are not sealed. People move, intermarry, and influence one another. But the narrative's pressure holds these two themes in tension to show how culture can bloom either with God or apart from him. And yet, as generations multiply, a darker pressure mounts. The text begins to insist on breadth rather than a few singular acts. It reports a spreading corruption, a general hardening of imagination and conduct. Language in the narrative shifts from discrete incidents to sweeping description. The inclination of the human heart is repeatedly summarized as bent toward evil, and violence fills the earth. Genesis 6:5. That is a theological way of pointing to systemic failure. Sin is no longer contained. It becomes the air people breathe. What made this collapse so severe? The narrative points to a moral and relational erosion. Where humanity once walked with God and called on his name, now imaginations of evil dominate. The social and familial structures that protect the vulnerable and cultivate humility have frayed. Technology, art, and the comforts of settled life exist, but they are not mere neutral tools. They are being wielded within hearts that have turned inward, seeking power and satisfaction apart from God. A striking and much-debated passage appears at this threshold, Genesis 6:1-4, which speaks of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and introduces the enigmatic Nephilim, rendered sometimes as mighty men or the giants. Scholars and traditions have read this passage in two main ways, each with different implications for what life looked like in those last days before the flood. The first major reading is that sons of God refers to heavenly beings, angels or divine figures, who became entangled with human women. In this view, the text describes a crossing of boundaries between the divine and human realms, producing offspring who were extraordinary in stature or renown. If this is the picture, the pre-flood world included a blatant mixing of orders, a cosmic disorder that reflects rebellion not only on earth, but in the heavens. The second prominent reading understands sons of God as referring to the godly line of Seth, while daughters of men describes the people descending from Cain. From this perspective, the narrative warns against the faithless assimilation of the people who called themselves by God's name into ungodly alliances, marriage, and cultural absorption that diluted worship and allowed violence to flourish. If this reading is correct, the problem is not the intrusion of supernatural beings, but the collapse of moral boundary and covenant fidelity. Both readings are represented in the history of interpretation, and each yields different emphases. One stresses cosmic rebellion and its consequences. The other stresses human faithlessness and the breakdown of covenantal identity. The biblical text itself does not settle every detail for us, and prudence requires we hold both interpretations as possibilities while we attend to the text's clear themes, a widespread corruption of heart and a world growing ripe for judgment. The narrative is unambiguous about the result. Violence and unrighteousness become pervasive, and unambiguous as well about God's emotional response. The Spirit of God withdraws patience, and the Lord is said to be grieved over what he made. Genesis 6:3-6. Even as the darkness thickens, there are still pockets of faithful life. The recitation of generations continues, and within that list a man named Noah appears as a hinge. He will be described in the coming chapters as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Genesis 6:9. The wording is deliberately reminiscent of Enoch. A way of life, walking with God, characterizes the remnant that will survive the coming purge. The presence of such figures shows that God's mercy is never absent, even when his justice is preparing to move. The narrative balances grief with grace. The Creator experiences sorrow over the ruin, yet he preserves a way out. So what did life look like before the flood? It looked like a world of extraordinary contrasts. It was a world where the first marriages and the first songs were formed, where tents and cities emerged, where the craft of metalwork and the shaping of the first musical instruments raised humanity to new heights. It was also a world where jealousies hardened into murder, where pride was sung as a badge of honor, where the imagination of human hearts became bent toward harm. It was a world in which God still walked with a few, but watched multitudes turn away. The stage was set, cultural brilliance rubbing shoulders with moral collapse, a divine sorrow gathering like a storm cloud on the horizon. At this point the narrative tightens, focusing from the broad sweep of generations to the immediate condition of the earth. The recurring refrain, humanity's increasing inclination to evil, begins to feel less like history and more like a diagnosis. How did this happen? Part of the answer is plainly social. Structures of loyalty and worship frayed, safety nets for the weak weakened, the arts and the technologies that should have glorified the Creator were harnessed to self-glorification and dominance. Part of the answer is spiritual, a refusal to stand under God's authority, to call on his name as a daily posture, allowed selfishness and violence to calcify into culture. In the years between Eden and the generation of Noah, public life was full of the fruits of human ingenuity, music that could move a community, metalwork that opened new possibilities for tools and weapons, cities that provided shelter and shared life. Yet the text wants us to observe the moral valence of those fruits. Innovation without worship can accelerate the reach of sin. The earliest artisans and musicians were not merely neutral inventors. Their creations became parts of a civilization now bending toward destruction. Into that tense atmosphere Noah is born, named with a hope for rest and comfort, a human hinge between despair and deliverance. But the rest implied by his name is not automatic. It will be achieved through difficult obedience and through a judgment that spares life at the cost of widespread loss. The narrative in these chapters keeps our attention on the choices of individuals and the swell of communal consequence. When a people abandon their worship, the structures that sustain humane life, mercy, restraint, mutual responsibility, slide away. The result is not simply ideological error, but an increase in harm. The earth is filled with violence. The story, then, tightens toward an encounter that will force a divine decision. The Creator, who had formed humanity as his image-bearers and set them to tend the world, stands now at an awful crossroads. Preserve his creation, but allow corruption to spread unchecked, or act to restrain the spread of death and make way for a renewed beginning. The account will present this decision with both gravity and sorrow. Even as God prepares a course of action, his heart is described in the simplest human terms. He is grieved. This grief is significant theologically. It affirms that God's justice is not a cold mechanism, but the response of a loving Creator to the ruin of what he made. What life looked like before the flood, then, is a portrait of tension, blessing and curse braided together. Families and cities flourished, songs and forges rang out, yet behind the glitter a moral rot spread, and the cry of violence rose up from the ground. A remnant walked with God, Enoch, Methuselah, and now Noah, offering a promise that God's mercy remains. But the balance was tipping. The next movement in the story will make clear the form of God's response and the way mercy finds a path through judgment. The ark, and the commands surrounding its making, will be the actions by which God both judges and preserves. At this hinge, the narrative pauses, on the very edge of action. The voices of invention and song still echo, but so does the sound of grief. The question hangs in the air, as it did in the days of those early generations. What will God do when the creatures he loves turn their creativity to destruction? The answer is coming, and it will force every community to reckon with the cost of turning from God and the cost of obedience to him. The generations kept moving forward, and with each generation the two lines, those who drifted and those who called, left their marks on the earth in ways both beautiful and tragic. The descendants of Cain did not vanish into the dust. They multiplied, settled, and began to shape a recognizable human world. They put stakes into the ground and raised tents. They led flocks and learned the rhythms of pasture and trade. They struck metal into tools, and sometimes into swords. They struck chords and hollowed gourds, until sound became song. Names recorded in the genealogy stand like signposts of early culture. A father of tent dwellers and livestock mastery, an origin story for the first musician, a craftsman who worked bronze and iron. These were real advances, shelter for families, instruments to bind a people together, tools to move mountains of labor. Yet the text insists that innovation without humility before God can be dangerous. The same hands that shape beauty can also fashion instruments of domination. The image of the city rising out of exile is striking because it encapsulates both human ambition and human vulnerability. Cain names the city after his son, a gesture that asserts selfhood and legacy. Cities collect people, stories, and power. They concentrate resources and create reputations. They are places where genius meets temptation. In Cain's descendants, we see the first clear pattern of culture that defines itself without appealing to the maker, where worship thins and self-interest thickens. Even music can be enlisted to acclaim the self rather than to praise God. Where metalwork opens practical possibility, it can also sharpen implements of harm. Lamech's brief, almost defiant poem of vengeance is a window into a hardened ethic, a culture that boasts of its own ability to retaliate and protect itself by force. When a song declares honor measured by the strength to wound, society's moral compass has already bent. But while those cities and arts grew, another line kept a rhythm that harkened back to Eden's walk. Seth's descendants did not produce the same list of technological firsts in the text. Instead, the narrator records a spiritual habit. People began to call on the name of the Lord. Worship becomes the organizing center of life for that community. This is not a grand institutional description, but a simple notice of people who practice prayer, who kept the language of dependence, who remembered that existence is received, not merely seized. The contrast is not presented as a tidy binary. Families married across lines, culture diffused, and influence crossed boundaries. Yet the biblical storyteller wants us to watch two tendencies. One that builds while forgetting God, and one that preserves a posture of reliance. Out of Seth's line comes a startling figure, Enoch, whose life is described in a way that halts the flow of mere age and genealogy. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. Genesis 5:24. The wording suggests a life shaped by steady communion. Walking with God is not a dramatic anomaly in this context. It is portrayed as the ordinary rhythm of a faithful heart. Enoch's removal from the scene is presented not as a punitive or secretive vanishing, but as a sign. God honors those who cultivate companionship with him, even amid a world leaning away. Later reflections in Scripture place Enoch among the faithful, but here the simplest point is that even in the long sweep of human corruption, true fellowship with God remains possible and is recognized by God himself. Methuselah, the next famous name, stretches human time on the page. His longevity, recorded in the chapters of Genesis, functions as more than a curiosity. It reminds us that these generations held memories and influences across centuries in a way foreign to our modern rhythms. Families transmitted hopes and fears over lifetimes that spanned centuries. When Methuselah's son is named, when Lamech names his child Noah and says that this child will bring comfort from the toil of the ground, the narrator invites us to hear a prophetic hope offered in grief. Names are not casual in this story world. They carry prayer and expectation. Noah's name, rest, comfort, consolation, speaks into a world already learning what curse and sweat mean. Yet hope does not eradicate the prevailing tendency toward ruin. The narrative turns its voice and expands its scope. Where earlier chapters lingered on individuals and episodes, now the language becomes sweeping, an assessment, a diagnosis of an entire age. The storyteller no longer lists incidents so much as declares a condition. The imagination of human hearts, it says, was bent toward evil continually. Violence filled the earth. That is the text's way of saying the problem is structural as much as personal. It is not merely that a few wicked people appeared. It is that the moral atmosphere had shifted. Institutions, families, customs, those scaffolds that carry a people through virtue or vice, had been eroded. Self-centered desire had become a contagious norm. At that tense horizon, a remarkable and puzzling passage appears, brief, elliptical, and much discussed. Genesis speaks of the sons of God and of the daughters of men, and it introduces the name Nephilim, sometimes translated mighty men or giants. Because the wording is compact and enigmatic, readers across centuries have asked, what exactly happened here, and what does it tell us about life in those last days? Two principal readings have rooted themselves in the history of interpretation. The first identifies the sons of God as heavenly beings, angels or divine figures, who overstep their bounds and intermarry with human women, producing extraordinary offspring. This view, ancient and present in many early Jewish readings, casts the pre-flood scene as an intrusion of cosmic disorder into human life. If this is the picture, the world before the flood was destabilized on more than one level. Not only had human hearts turned, but the boundaries between created orders were transgressed. The presence of such beings and their offspring would suggest a reality in which cosmic rebellion had fenestrated itself into human existence. The second prominent reading understands the phrase more domestically. Sons of God are seen as the godly descendants of Seth, while daughters of men refers to women from the line of Cain, people estranged from covenant faithfulness. On this reading, the problem is less cosmic and more social and spiritual. The faithful community assimilated into the wider ungodly culture through marriage and alliance, and those unions diluted worship and invited patterns of violence. The narrative then warns against the erosion of distinctiveness. It is a moral and covenantal collapse rather than a tale of angelic rebellion. Each reading carries different implications. The first emphasizes the breadth of rebellion. If divine beings fell or crossed boundaries, the rupture includes heaven as well as earth. The second emphasizes the fragility of covenant identity. If the people who knew God failed to remain separate in devotion, the result was predictable social corrosion. The biblical text itself does not force readers to choose with certainty. It offers a compressed report and lets the implications unfold. Prudence and humility counsel that we hold both interpretations as live possibilities, to note how each illuminates the text's primary thrust, a world growing morally and relationally bankrupt. Whatever the precise mechanics implied by those verses, the conclusion the narrator insists upon is clear and heartbreaking. Violence and corruption were pervasive. The language grows grim, not to titillate, but to diagnose. Sin had become normalized. Mercy had been strained. The very order God intended for creation groaned under the weight of human choice. Genesis frames this in anthropological, not merely personal terms. The human imagination, the seat of intent and desire, persistently leaned toward evil. Where earlier culture might have fostered restraint, now appetite reigned. The Scripture gives voice to God's reaction in words that are tender and terrible. The Lord observes the degree of corruption and declares a limit. My spirit will not abide in man forever. Genesis 6:3. It is not a capricious withdrawal. It expresses a kind of divine threshold, an announcement that the permissive space for human self-rule has reached a dangerous point. And then there is the language that pierces the narrative. And the Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. Genesis 6:6. These are not metaphors to suggest God becomes capricious. They are the biblical voice moving truthfully into how God relates to his creatures. The grief is real, the judgment is serious, and yet within that grief there is still room for mercy. Notice the balanced theology here. God's response combines sorrow and action. He grieves because what he made is being ruined, but righteous concern also leads him to act. Compassion does not preclude justice. Indeed, God's sadness over human ruin is a motive toward both correction and preservation. The narrator does not linger on a cold calculus of punishment. Instead, Genesis portrays a God who bears the cost of judgment in his own heart. Into this darkening scene, a line of hope remains visible. Noah is introduced not as a mere human statistic, but as a character defined by moral distinctness. The text says of him, in deliberate contrast to the general report, that Noah was righteous, blameless in his generation, and that he walked with God. Genesis 6:9. The portrait is stark. In a time when many hearts bent toward harm, one man cultivated a walk with the Lord. Righteous here signals a life marked by integrity and alignment with God's ways. Blameless in his generation suggests that, compared to his contemporaries, Noah stood out as a vessel of faithfulness. The same verb used of Enoch, walking with God, appears in Noah's description, linking these two figures as archetypes of faithful response in corrupt times. God's choice to preserve Noah is not arbitrary favoritism. It is an act of grace anchored in the reality of a life that reflects God's character. Mercy finds a shape. Judgment will sweep across a corrupted world, but within that judgment God makes provision for life to continue. Noah becomes the means through which God preserves a remnant and a promise. The narrative characterizes this not as an escape from consequence, but as a corridor of salvation. God will judge, but he will also provide a vessel of safety. At this point, the biblical account tightens into the moment of decision. The text reports that God told Noah of his intention to bring a flood upon the earth to destroy man and beast because of the pervasive corruption and violence. Even as the scope of the coming judgment is universal, covering both human and animal life, the presence of Noah's righteousness frames the narrative in mercy. A family will be preserved to steward a renewed creation. The contrast is sharp and urgent. Where the earth had become saturated in wickedness, a faithful remnant will carry forward what is worth carrying. There is a striking detail in the narrative that has influenced countless readers. God sets a period in which he will delay immediate action. The declaration, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever," is joined to another phrase elsewhere, that the Lord would limit human life to a certain term, and the text records a time frame, 120 years in some readings, during which the proclamation of impending judgment functions in the world. Genesis 6:3 has been understood in various ways, but within the narrative it serves as a kind of pause. God announces the reality of impending judgment, yet allows a season for the message to take root, for warning to be given, and for Noah's obedience to begin. The legal and ethical effect is powerful. There is time to respond, and that time is not to be wasted. We should not press the exact number into a literal rule for modern lifespan or an interpretive box we weren't given. The immediate story function is what matters here. A period of warning precedes the act of judgment. What is compelling about that delay is the moral pressure it creates. If life continues for generations, people will either be soft towards the warning or hardened by it. The scene invites us to imagine a long season in which the ark's blueprint is, perhaps, a whisper and an object of ridicule. A decade after decade in which the faithful family labors in the face of societal scorn. The 120-year element intensifies. Rather than mitigates the tragic irony, the Lord warns, people carry on as usual. How did Noah respond? The text emphasizes obedience over speculation. Noah's righteousness is expressed in tangible faithfulness. When told by God of what would come, he began to act in trust, building, preparing, calling his household to follow. His life stands not as moral perfection, but as faithful compliance with God's command in a world that preferred its own ways. That obedience becomes the locus of God's preserving mercy. Here the story reveals a central theological truth. God's judgment is not capricious retribution, but a measured response to the reality of human choice, and God's mercy often arrives through the obedience of his people. The narrative in these chapters does not turn sensational about the mechanics of the catastrophe. It is interested in hearts, choices, and the moral grammar of a turning world. Yet it is also precise enough to tell us that the flood will be comprehensive enough to wipe away the entrenched corruption, but merciful enough to seed a new beginning through the ark. This double movement, sorrowful judgment and provident rescue, keeps the portrait theologically balanced. As the story tightens toward action, one can almost hear the two strains that have been weaving through the preceding chapters. On one side we have the sound of instruments, the clang of forge and the bustle of cities. On the other, the quiet cadence of someone who daily walked with God. The first sound reaches its apex in the social normalization of violence. The second persists as a faithful counterpoint. The pressure mounts until a divine decision is required. God's sorrow gathers like an inexorable storm front. In the narrative, the decision is not capricious wrath. It is a necessary act to restrain the spread of death and to protect the future of creation. Now the drama narrows to a personal call. God, in his grief and yet in his mercy, commissions Noah to be the means of survival. He gives a task that will be costly, uncomfortable, and, to the eyes of his contemporaries, likely absurd. Build a vessel that will ride out the waters that will come upon all the earth. The commission is not merely practical, it is formative. To build the ark is to embody faith in a concrete, community-shaping way. It is to testify in the face of cultural ridicule that God is real, that sin is serious, that obedience matters. We should be careful here not to leap into technicalities the text does not demand at this stage. The story in Genesis will later supply dimensions, materials, and specifications, details that inspire humility before the workmanship of God. For now, consider the theological shape of the commission. God speaks, Noah trusts, Noah begins to prepare for a future that will vindicate his faith. The building of the ark is both shelter for life and statement against the drift of an entire age. There is an urgency in the scene that deserves solemn attention. Imagine the social cost of such obedience. A man working decades on a task his neighbors mock, perhaps a household strained by the scale of the project. Maybe a man whose children's youth will be touched by the long shadow of that labor. The narrative invites us to see righteousness not simply as inner piety, but as costly engagement that bears social consequences. Noah's family, by responding, will both endure judgment and preserve a future. At the same time, Genesis insists that mercy is not arbitrary. God preserves life through established means, a remnant, an ark, the obedience of a household. So the theology here is sober and hopeful at once. Hope is not sentiment, it is embedded in concrete preservation. God's design is to reset creation, and yet to honor faithful participation in that renewal. The stage is now set in dramatic, sorrowful clarity. The cultural fruits, music, craft, cities still echo. The moral rot still sits like a stain. The faithful remnant still walks with God. The Lord's grief has been heard. His decision has been announced. A period of warning has begun. And a man named Noah has been called to embody God's saving work through costly obedience. The narrative draws a line. Soon the rains will come, and the world as it had been known will be inundated. But whether the deluge will be the end or the beginning depends on the response of those who hear the warning. What then does this ancient portrait mean for us, who stand at a distance in time and culture? The pre-flood world, as Genesis paints it, is not simply an exotic antiquity, it is a mirror. It shows how human brilliance, our capacity to make shelter, to compose songs, to hammer metals, can flourish even as moral vision decays. It shows how worship can either anchor a people or be eroded by cultural seduction. It shows how God, when confronted by human ruin, experiences real sorrow and takes measured action that combines judgment and mercy. The portrait issues an alarm that is both ancient and urgent. Civilization can advance materially, even while it dismantles its own moral underpinnings. If the question is, what did life look like before the flood? The answer is necessarily complex. It looked like a world of long days and long legacies, where families transmitted stories across centuries. It looked like cities and crafts, music and tools. It looked like marriages and the first griefs of exile. It looked like the first murder and the rupture of brotherhood. And it looked like a God who walked with some and grieved for many. The pre-flood scene invites serious reflection on how culture forms character, how technological or artistic progress does not guarantee spiritual maturity, and how God's mercy often chooses faithful people to steward a new beginning. The immediate horizon of the story brings us to the ark's construction and the oncoming deluge. The account ahead will describe the trial of faith Noah endured, the practical obedience required to build a vessel in the face of derision, and the dramatic unfolding of judgment and preservation. It will also invite deeper reflection on covenant, covenantal signs, and the restoration of creation's purpose. For now we stand at the shore, watching the clouds gather, hearing the first whisper of rain in the air of narrative memory. Reflect on this. A world that combined brilliance and brutality became ripe for judgment, not because it was clever or powerful, but because it had turned its inventiveness inward, towards self-preservation and domination rather than worship and stewardship. Yet even there, mercy finds its way through the faithful remnant. That theological posture, sorrow at sin, beauty in obedience, mercy amid justice, is central to the pre-flood picture. If this account of early human life stirs something in you, consider what it means for your own context. Where in our age do we see the same braided pattern of cultural achievement and moral compromise? Where are we, corporately and individually, tempted to use our gifts apart from the Maker? And where, in the quiet persistence of faith, do we see people walking with God who shape a different future? In the next chapter of this story, the narrative will narrow from the long sweep to particular acts, the specific call to Noah, instructions that transform faith into labor, the arrival of the waters, and the rhythm of covenant that follows. The ark will become the symbol by which God both judges and preserves. I invite you to reflect on what you have heard here and to share this portrait with someone who needs to consider how brilliance and brutality can coexist, and what hope looks like in the face of divine sorrow. If this message has touched you, share it with someone who might need this reminder of both God's grief and God's mercy. Join us next time as we follow Noah's obedience more closely. The building of the ark, the responses of his generation, and the way the flood itself becomes both judgment and a new beginning.